Sidney Poitier's final acting performance for over a decade wasn't just another buddy cop comedy. It was a film where Darth Vader's voice guided criminals into teaching kids job skills, where a future Emmy winner beat out the director's own daughter for a role, and where a glaring geographic mistake made it past editors. From Curtis Mayfield's funky soundtrack featuring Mavis Staples to bizarre casting decisions and production mishaps, this 1977 crime comedy holds secrets that reveal Hollywood's strangest behind-the-scenes stories. Fact 1. Darth Vader's big year. 1977 was an absolutely incredible year for James Earl Jones, though most people only remember half of what made it so special. While everyone knows that Jones provided the iconic voice of Darth Vader in the original Star Wars movie that year, far fewer realize that just a few months later he was also starring as the retired detective Joshua Burke in A Piece of the Action, where he spent the entire film blackmailing Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby into helping troubled youth. The timing of these two completely different roles couldn't have been more perfect or strange. In Star Wars, Jones voiced one of cinema's most terrifying villains, using his deep, commanding voice to deliver menacing lines about the power of the dark side. But in A Piece of the Action, released in October of 1977, that same powerful voice belonged to a character who was technically doing good by forcing two criminals to turn their lives around and help kids get jobs. What makes this even more interesting is that Jones initially didn't want his name in the Star Wars credits because he felt his voice work was too minor compared to David Prowse, who physically performed Darth Vader in the costume. Meanwhile, in A Piece of the Action, Jones received full billing as one of the main stars, playing a character who drives the entire plot forward through his clever blackmail scheme. The contrast between these roles shows Jones's incredible range as a performer. One minute he's the voice of galactic evil, and the next he's a retired Chicago cop with a heart of gold who just happens to use some morally questionable methods to help society. Both characters use intimidation to get what they want, but for completely opposite purposes. It's almost like Jones played both the devil and the angel on your shoulder in the same year, and somehow made both characters equally memorable and compelling in their own unique ways. Fact 2. Poitier's decade. Long screen goodbye. Sidney Poitier had no idea that A Piece of the Action would mark the end of his acting career for more than 10 years, making his performance as the smooth-talking con man Manny Durrell an accidental farewell to one of Hollywood's most groundbreaking careers. After wrapping this film in 1977, Poitier made a decision that would take him completely away from acting until 1988, when he finally returned to star in Shoot to Kill with Tom Berenger. The reason behind this extended break was Poitier's growing passion for directing, which had begun with Buck and the Preacher in 1972. By the time he finished A Piece of the Action, Poitier was ready to step completely behind the camera and focus all his energy on guiding other actors rather than performing himself. He had already proven himself as both director and star in the previous two films of what became known as the Uptown Trilogy, but this third film would be where he decided to hang up his acting hat for good, at least temporarily. What makes this even more significant is that Poitier was at the height of his fame and could have continued acting in major roles for years to come. He was only 50 years old and had already broken countless barriers as the first black actor to win an Academy Award for Best Actor. Instead of capitalizing on his star power, he chose to use his influence to create opportunities for other performers and tell stories from behind the camera. During those 10 years away from acting, Poitier directed several successful films, including Stir Crazy with Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor, which became one of the highest-grossing films directed by a person of African descent. His decision to step away from acting allowed him to shape Hollywood in a completely different way, proving that sometimes the most important career moves are the ones that take you in an entirely new direction. Fact 3. Family business. Behind the camera. Sidney Poitier turned filmmaking into a true family affair by casting his older brother Cyril Poitier as Mr. Pointe Theodore, the janitor at the community center in A Piece of the Action, making this the third consecutive film in the Uptown Trilogy where family members appeared on screen together. This wasn't just a one-time favor either, as Cyril had already earned small parts in both Uptown Saturday Night in 1974 and Let's Do It Again in 1975, establishing what became a heartwarming tradition throughout the series. Cyril Poitier was more than just Sidney's older brother. He was actually one of the people who helped raise Sidney when they were growing up in the Bahamas and later in Florida. Born on November 11, 1911, on Cat Island in the Bahamas, Cyril was 16 years older than Sidney and played a father-like role in his younger brother's life. By the time Sidney became one of Hollywood's biggest stars, giving Cyril these small acting roles was both a way to include family in his success and a tribute to the man who had supported him from the very beginning. The role of Mr. Theodore, though small, was perfect for Cyril's quiet, dignified presence on screen. As the janitor at the youth center where Sidney's character Manny and Bill Cosby's character Dave are forced to work, Cyril's character represents the honest, hard-working people who keep communities running behind the scenes. It's a fitting metaphor for how Cyril had quietly supported Sidney's dreams for years. What makes this family casting even more special is that it shows Sidney Poitier's commitment to lifting up the people who mattered most to him, even when he had reached the pinnacle of Hollywood success. Rather than forgetting his roots, he made sure his brother could share in the experience of bringing these positive, uplifting stories to audiences around the world. Fact 4. Emmy winner beat director's daughter. Sheryl Lee Ralph landed her breakthrough film debut in A Piece of the Action by beating out Sidney Poitier's own daughter in auditions, a decision that showed Poitier's dedication to choosing the best actor for the role regardless of family connections. Ralph herself later acknowledged this remarkable moment, telling reporters that she had tremendous respect for a director who wouldn't simply hand the juiciest part in his film to his own child, especially when that role turned out to be one of the movie's most memorable and dramatically powerful performances. The role of Barbara Hanley was no small part either, as it featured one of the film's most intense scenes where Ralph's character absolutely destroys a social worker played by Hope Clark, calling her a poverty pimp and attacking her bourgeois attitudes in a moment that leaves audiences stunned. Ralph brought incredible authenticity to this explosive performance because she drew directly from her own life experiences, specifically remembering an angry confrontation with a girl at school who thought Ralph was trying to steal her boyfriend. Ralph told the story years later, explaining that this real-life encounter had stayed with her because the girl's raw anger was so powerful and memorable. When she auditioned for Poitier, she channeled that same energy and emotion, bringing a level of genuine fury and pain to the character that clearly impressed the director more than any family connection could have. This casting decision proved to be absolutely the right choice, as Ralph's performance in A Piece of the Action launched a career that would eventually lead her to win an Emmy Award in 2022 for her role as Barbara Howard in Abbott Elementary, making her the first black woman to win in that category in 35 years. The fact that her journey to Emmy success began with beating out the director's daughter in 1977 makes her achievement even more meaningful, and shows how talent truly can triumph over connections. Fact 5. Geographic goof goes unnoticed. One of the most glaring continuity errors in A Piece of the Action somehow made it past editors and into the final cut, when a huge sign reading LAPD appears clearly visible across the street during what's supposed to be a downtown Chicago scene. The mistake happens during a sequence where Sidney Poitier's character Manny is walking down the street with the group of students from the community center, and eagle-eyed viewers can spot the Los Angeles Police Department sign prominently displayed in the background, completely breaking the illusion that the characters are in the Windy City. This error reveals something that many viewers might not have realized about the production. While A Piece of the Action is set entirely in Chicago and the story revolves around Chicago cops, community centers, and neighborhoods, significant portions of the film were actually shot in Los Angeles. The movie's credits list both Chicago, Illinois, and Los Angeles, California as filming locations, but seeing the LAPD sign so prominently displayed makes it obvious just how much of the movie was filmed on the West Coast, rather than in the city where the story takes place. What makes this mistake even more amusing is that the film goes to great lengths, in other scenes, to establish its Chicago setting, with characters frequently mentioning the city and the plot revolving around retired Chicago detective Joshua Burke, played by James Earl Jones. The movie even includes some genuine Chicago location shots to help sell the setting, making the sudden appearance of Los Angeles police signage all the more jarring for anyone who notices it. This kind of continuity error was much more common in the 1970s, when film productions often mixed location shooting with studio work in different cities, and editors didn't have the digital tools available today to easily spot and fix these kinds of geographical mistakes before the film reached theaters. Fact 6. Curtis Mayfield's funkiest collaboration. The soundtrack for A Piece of the Action marked a unique moment in Curtis Mayfield's career when he chose to collaborate exclusively with Mavis Staples as a solo artist, leaving behind her famous siblings in the Staples Singers for what would become one of his most experimental and funky musical efforts. This decision created something completely different from Mayfield's previous soundtrack work, as Staples brought her powerful, throaty vocals to bear on Mayfield's increasingly funk-influenced compositions without the harmonious backing of her family group that had defined her sound for years. Billboard magazine took notice of this collaboration immediately, praising the album in their October 22, 1977 review by calling Mayfield's funky rhythms and evocative lyrics some of the composer's better recent efforts. The review specifically highlighted how Staples soulfully interpreted Mayfield's musical score while his backup session musicians supplied the funk that drove the entire project forward, creating a sound that was both familiar and surprisingly fresh for both artists involved. The standout tracks from this collaboration included Chocolate City, A Piece of the Action, Till Blossoms Bloom, and Coochie Coochie Coochie, which showcased Mayfield's ability to blend his socially conscious songwriting with the kind of dance-friendly funk that was becoming increasingly popular in the late 1970s. This wasn't Mayfield's first time working with Staples, as he had previously collaborated with the Staples Singers on the soundtrack for Let's Do It Again in 1975, but working with Mavis alone allowed both artists to explore new territory. The collaboration represented Mayfield's continued evolution from his early civil rights anthem days with the Impressions into his role as one of the pioneers of funk music, while giving Staples a chance to stretch her vocal abilities in a completely different musical context than she was used to with her family group. Fact 7. Box office disappointment. Despite star power, A Piece of the Action became the biggest financial disappointment of the Poitier-Cosby trilogy, earning only $5.4 million at the domestic box office, despite featuring three of Hollywood's most bankable stars at the height of their popularity. This surprisingly low performance made it clear that even the combined star power of Sidney Poitier, Bill Cosby, and James Earl Jones couldn't guarantee box office success, especially when audiences were expecting the same lighthearted comedy formula that had made the previous two films so profitable. The financial failure becomes even more puzzling when you consider that 1977 was actually a fantastic year for James Earl Jones, who was simultaneously voicing Darth Vader in Star Wars, one of the biggest blockbusters of all time. Meanwhile, Bill Cosby was at the peak of his television fame, and Sidney Poitier remained one of the most respected actors in Hollywood. On paper, this should have been a guaranteed hit, but something about the film just didn't connect with audiences the way Uptown Saturday Night and Let's Do It Again had managed to do. Part of the problem may have been that A Piece of the Action took a much more serious approach to its subject matter than its predecessors, focusing heavily on social issues and job training programs, rather than the pure escapist entertainment that audiences expected from a Poitier-Cosby collaboration. Critics noted that the film felt more like a lecture than a comedy, with Gene Siskel calling it patronizing and Roger Ebert criticizing its unbelievable situations and awkward dialogue. The box office numbers tell the story of audience expectations not being met, as moviegoers who came expecting another fun-filled romp instead found themselves watching a film that spent more time preaching about social responsibility than delivering the laughs and chemistry that had made the previous films so successful and profitable. Fact 8. The trilogy. That wasn't really a trilogy. The so-called Uptown trilogy of Uptown Saturday Night, Let's Do It Again, and A Piece of the Action is one of Hollywood's strangest examples of a trilogy that shares absolutely nothing except its two lead actors, with Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby playing completely different characters in each film without any connecting storylines, recurring themes, or shared universe elements. Unlike traditional movie trilogies where characters continue their adventures across multiple films, these three movies are essentially standalone stories that just happen to feature the same two stars working together multiple times over a 3-year period. In Uptown Saturday Night from 1974, Poitier and Cosby played Steve Jackson and Wardell Franklin, two friends who get mixed up with gangsters after their winning lottery ticket gets stolen during a nightclub robbery. Then, in Let's Do It Again from 1975, they became completely different people named Clyde Williams and Billy Foster, lodge members who traveled to New Orleans to fix a boxing match to raise money for their organization. Finally, in A Piece of the Action, they transformed once again into Manny Durrell and Dave Anderson, two high-class criminals who get blackmailed into helping at a community center. The only real connections between these films are that Poitier directed all three. They were all produced by First Artists Production Company, and they featured similar themes of friendship and community uplift within African American culture. Even some supporting actors appeared in multiple films, but they also played different characters each time, adding to the confusion about whether these movies were actually supposed to be connected in any meaningful way. This unusual approach to trilogy making shows how the term was used more as a marketing tool than an actual storytelling device, capitalizing on the proven chemistry between Poitier and Cosby, rather than creating any kind of coherent narrative universe that would justify calling them a true trilogy. Fact 9. Future TV stars started here. A piece of the action served as an unexpected launching pad for several actors who would go on to become major television stars throughout the 1970s and 80s, with the film's casting directors having an impressive eye for spotting young talent that would soon dominate American living rooms. The most notable of these future stars was Ernest Lee Thomas, who played one of the troubled youth in the community center and would become a household name just 1 year later when he landed the role of Roger Raj Thomas on the hit ABC sitcom What's Happening, where his catchphrase, "Hey, hey, hey," made him instantly recognizable to audiences across the country. Another significant find was Eric Laneuville, a New Orleans native who appeared in the film as one of the young people trying to turn their lives around under Sidney Poitier's guidance, and who would go on to have a remarkable career both in front of and behind the camera throughout the following decades. Laneuville became a familiar face on television shows throughout the late 70s and 80s, and eventually transitioned into directing, helming episodes of major series, and becoming one of the most respected African-American directors in television. The film also featured other young actors who would find success in television, creating what amounted to a showcase for the next generation of black performers who would help define the landscape of American television comedy and drama. What makes this casting even more impressive is that Sidney Poitier, as the film's director, clearly had an instinct for recognizing raw talent and potential star quality in these young performers, even when they were playing relatively small roles as community center kids. This pattern of discovering future television stars wasn't accidental, as Poitier was committed to providing opportunities for young African-American actors at a time when such roles were still relatively rare in Hollywood, making a piece of the action an important stepping stone for careers that would flourish on the small screen. Fact 10. Critics called it patronizing preaching. The critical reception for a piece of the action was absolutely brutal, with two of America's most influential film critics delivering scathing reviews that called out the movie for being more interested in delivering heavy-handed social messages than entertaining its audience. Gene Siskel, the respected Chicago Tribune critic, completely demolished the film by calling it a patronizing, simple-minded lecture on how young blacks can get jobs, adding the particularly cutting observation that audiences probably thought they were going to see a comedy, but instead got a movie where comedy was only an afterthought. Roger Ebert, Siskel's longtime partner and rival, was equally harsh in his 2-star review, writing that while the film had its heart in the right place, its key situations were so unbelievable, and its dialogue so awkward, that nothing could help save it from being a disappointing experience. Ebert specifically criticized one of the film's most cringe-worthy scenes, where Sidney Poitier leads a group of kids into a high-rise lobby to demonstrate the power of common courtesy, calling the sequence phony and pointing out how simplistic its solution was to the real problems facing young black job applicants. What made these reviews particularly damaging was that both Siskel and Ebert had generally supported the previous 2 films in the trilogy, making their harsh criticism of a piece of the action feel like a betrayal of the goodwill that Poitier and Cosby had built up with audiences and critics alike. The critics weren't just attacking the movie's entertainment value. They were calling out its entire approach to addressing social issues as condescending and unrealistic. These reviews helped cement a piece of the action's reputation as the weakest and most problematic entry in the Uptown trilogy, with critics essentially arguing that good intentions and star power couldn't make up for a screenplay that talked down to its audience instead of respecting their intelligence. Fact 11. The Great Escape Stunt. The opening sequence of a piece of the action features one of the most impressive practical stunts of Sidney Poitier's directing career, with his character Dave Anderson making a death-defying escape by leaping from a high window into the back of a covered van after successfully completing a major heist. This dramatic stunt sequence was executed entirely with practical effects and real stunt work, creating a genuinely thrilling moment that demonstrated Poitier's skill not just as an actor, but as an action director who understood how to create genuine excitement on screen. Even Roger Ebert, who was otherwise highly critical of the film, specifically praised this opening sequence in his review, describing it as well handled, and noting that the gimmick of how to escape from an upper-floor window with the loot was nicely executed. Ebert's praise for this sequence becomes even more significant when you consider that he gave the movie only 2 stars out of 4, and criticized almost every other aspect of the film, making his positive comments about the escape stunt stand out as one of the few elements that actually worked as intended. The sequence showcases Poitier's character as a master safecracker who has clearly planned every detail of his escape route, demonstrating the kind of professional expertise that makes him such an effective criminal before he's forced to redirect those skills toward helping young people. The stunt required careful coordination between the stunt performers, camera operators, and the vehicle crew to ensure that the timing was perfect and the leap looked both dangerous and believable. This opening escape also serves an important storytelling purpose by establishing the high level of skill and planning that both main characters possess, which makes it more believable later when they're able to successfully navigate the complex challenges of working with troubled youth while also trying to outsmart their mysterious blackmailer. Fact 12. Uncomfortable dance floor dialogue. A piece of the action contains one of the most uncomfortable and problematic moments in the entire Uptown trilogy, occurring during a disco scene where an unnamed female dancer approaches Bill Cosby's character Dave Anderson and delivers a line that has aged incredibly poorly over the decades. The woman tells Dave that he hasn't danced with her all night, and then threatens that if he doesn't dance with her, she's going to holler rape, creating a moment that was likely intended as lighthearted comedy, but instead comes across as deeply inappropriate and troubling to modern audiences. This particular piece of dialogue stands out as especially jarring because it treats false accusations of serious crimes as a casual joke, turning what should be a fun disco scene into something that makes viewers cringe rather than laugh. The line appears to have been written as a way to show Dave's appeal to women and create some kind of comedic tension, but the choice to use such loaded language around sexual assault allegations creates an uncomfortable viewing experience that completely derails the scene's intended mood. What makes this moment even more problematic in hindsight is how it reflects the casual attitude toward sexual assault that was unfortunately common in many films from this era, where such serious topics were often treated as punchlines rather than the serious matters they actually are. The fact that this line was included in a film that was otherwise trying to deliver positive social messages about community improvement and helping young people makes it even more out of place and inappropriate. The disco scene itself was clearly meant to showcase the nightlife culture of the late 1970s and provide some romantic subplot development for Cosby's character, but this particular exchange overshadows any positive elements and serves as a reminder of how much social attitudes have evolved since the film was made. Fact 13. Curtis Mayfield's P-Funk influence. The A-piece of the action soundtrack marked a fascinating turning point in Curtis Mayfield's musical evolution as he began experimenting with P-Funk-style instrumentals that represented a significant departure from the socially conscious soul sound that had made him famous with the Impressions and his earlier solo work. This musical experimentation showed Mayfield's ability to stay ahead of the curve in popular music, as he was already incorporating elements of the funk movement that George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic had been pioneering, but applying his own unique Chicago-influenced spin to create something that was both familiar and completely new. Music critics and fans noticed this shift immediately, with some describing the instrumental tracks on the album as having an almost P-Funk quality that pushed beyond Mayfield's traditional boundaries, while still maintaining his signature sophisticated approach to rhythm melody. This experimentation was particularly evident in the more dance-oriented tracks that were designed to complement the film's disco scenes and urban nightlife sequences, where Mayfield needed to create music that would feel authentic to the late 1970s club scene. What makes this musical evolution even more significant is that it demonstrated Mayfield's uncanny ability to predict where popular music was heading, as the funk and disco fusion he was exploring in 1977 would become one of the dominant sounds of the late 70s and early 80s. His willingness to incorporate these heavier, more rhythm-driven elements while working with Mavis Staples showed that he wasn't content to simply repeat his earlier successes, but was constantly pushing himself to grow as an artist and composer. This soundtrack serves as a bridge between Mayfield's earlier civil rights era work and the more dance-oriented music that would dominate the remainder of the decade, proving his versatility and forward-thinking approach to creating music for film. Fact 14. James Earl Jones, the Super Detective. The entire plot of A Piece of the Action depends on retired detective Joshua Burke, played by James Earl Jones, possessing almost supernatural detective abilities that allow him to solve complex crimes based on the flimsiest possible evidence, creating one of the most unbelievable story elements in the entire film. According to the movie's logic, Burke manages to identify both Sidney Poitier's character Manny and Bill Cosby's character Dave as the masterminds behind separate major crimes simply by observing an empty safe in one scene and some broken handcuffs in another, then somehow making the incredible leap from these basic clues to pinpointing exactly who committed these elaborate heists. Even devoted fans of the film have pointed out how ridiculous this plot device is, noting that Burke's detective work makes Peter Falk's Columbo character look like a complete amateur by comparison, since at least Columbo actually gathered real evidence and built logical cases against his suspects. The movie never bothers to explain how Burke made these connections or what investigative steps he took between seeing these random pieces of evidence and showing up to blackmail two complete strangers, leaving audiences to just accept that he's some kind of detective genius who can solve cases through pure intuition. This plot hole becomes even more glaring when you consider that both Manny and Dave are supposed to be master criminals who have never been caught before, suggesting they're extremely careful and skilled at covering their tracks. Yet somehow Burke cracks their methods instantly based on almost no real evidence, making their reputations as untouchable criminals seem completely unearned and undermining the entire premise of the story. The screenwriters clearly needed a way to get these two characters into the community center, but the method they chose strains credibility so badly that it becomes a distraction from everything else happening in the movie. Fact 15. Cheryl Lee Ralph's star-making audition. Cheryl Lee Ralph's powerhouse performance as Barbara Hanley in A Piece of the Action came directly from a real-life confrontation she experienced during her school years when an angry classmate came to her dorm room to confront her about supposedly having eyes on the girl's boyfriend. Ralph later told reporters that she never forgot that girl's raw anger and intensity, and when she auditioned for Sidney Poitier, she channeled that exact same energy and emotion to create one of the film's most memorable and explosive moments on screen. The scene that resulted from this personal experience became the movie's most dramatically powerful moment, where Ralph's character absolutely destroys Hope Clark's social worker character by calling her a poverty pimp and attacking her bourgeois attitudes in a confrontation that leaves audiences completely stunned. Ralph's performance in this scene is so authentic and intense that it feels completely real rather than scripted, which makes perfect sense given that she was drawing directly from her own memories of genuine anger and confrontation. What makes this story even more remarkable is that Ralph was competing against Sidney Poitier's own daughter for this role, and her ability to tap into this real emotional experience is what ultimately won her the part and launched her film career. She told Variety years later that she had that specific scene down perfectly because the emotions were so deeply embedded in her memory from that confrontation with her schoolmate. This audition technique of using personal emotional memories to inform dramatic performances shows Ralph's natural instincts as an actor, even at the very beginning of her career. The fact that this approach helped her beat out the director's daughter for the role demonstrates how powerful authentic emotion can be in creating memorable screen moments, and it established Ralph as a performer who could bring genuine depth and intensity to her characters right from her very first film role.